Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jörg Rocholl. I'm the president of ESMT, European School of Management and Technology. I'd like to very warmly welcome you to tonight's open lecture with the title Civilization, the West and the Rest, which will be delivered by Neil Ferguson. As some of you may know or already know, all of our open lectures have been designed to focus on questions of current intellectual concern and to present speakers who, through their achievements and expertise, have become thought leaders in their respective field and who influence public discussion in these fields. In this sense, we are very pleased to welcome Neil Ferguson tonight, as he is one of the most erudite and maybe even provocative social and economic thinkers of our time. I personally still remember Neil's force as a speaker from my times as a PhD student at Columbia, and I think it was, we just figured out this must have been in '99 when I could escape from my ground work classes as a PhD student. And I truly remember this as an absolutely fascinating talk. In fact, I also remember the time after the talk, which was the reception, which basically was there were wines served from the domains of Philippe de Rothschild. So this was actually another very nice part of this talk. So in that sense, I'm very happy to see you again, Neil, and would like to thank you very much for spending your time with us. In particular, I'd like to thank the American Academy, Gary Smith in particular, who generously made it possible to have this open lecture here at ESMT tonight, and in particular to have the prestigious Stephen M. Kellen lecture here. So thank you very much, Gary, for making this possible. Also, I'd like to thank Ullstein Buchverlage for their cooperation, Tagesspiegel for their support as our media partner, and of course, Brooke Unger of The Economist, who kindly agreed to moderate tonight's lecture. Just on briefly on the procedure, all our open lectures are meant as a platform for discussion, for questions and answers. So therefore, they will allow scholars to communicate their insights to a wider audience than just their pure academic circle, and leave ample time for questions and answers. So, and also I'd like to cordially invite you to a little drinks reception as a post-lecture. Even, and this is what I have to admit, the Rothschilds this time were not among the winemakers for this event. First of all, and this is of course the most important part, I'd like to wish all of us an intellectually stimulating evening, and like to ask Gary Smith to come and portray the Stephen M. Kellen lecture for us, and later Brooke Unger will introduce tonight's speaker, Neil Ferguson. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Rocholl. It's wonderful to be back at the ESMT, and because the American Academy has either short-term visitors, fellows, and others who often are in fields which bear upon the work being done here, and we're delighted at the growing cooperation between the two institutions. I also, first of all, want to greet two trustees, a founding trustee, John Kornblum, a recent trustee, Neil Ferguson, and thank you for your work on the Academy as well as everything else. Neil Ferguson is my purpose here is just to say something about what the Stephen M. Kellen lecture is. And both Neil Ferguson and the ESMT are the perfect partners to host this lecture, because the villa in which the American Academy resides was the private home of his father-in-law, of Hans Arnhold and Ludmilla Arnhold, who ran the great bank Arnhold and Esblai Ritter, moving the headquarters to New York wisely in 1933. And Stephen Kellen is married one of the two Arnhold daughters, Anna Maria Kellen, who is living in New York now at the ripe young age of 93. Stephen Kellen, of course, was a great private banker, and of course it's a world that Neil Ferguson has written about quite eloquently. It's, I guess all one can say, I missed the first lecture you gave at the American Academy, unfortunately, a number of years ago, but it was, the discussion I know was so vibrant, and that it's as if I was there. I've heard so much about it, so I'm really glad to be able to be here for this. I'm sure it was like all of your books, with a truly fresh perspective, embedded, bristling with scholarly annotation and proof. And this book seems to be no different. The last Stephen M. Kellen lecture was Paul Volcker a year ago, also very timely. And I think that I know that family is proud that we're able to host you here tonight, and that you are this year's lecturer. I also want to greet the Ambassador of Great Britain, our friend. And otherwise, I want to turn over the floor to our friend who's been here since 2007 to do the real moderation, Bruckanger. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gary. Thank you, ASMT, and thank you very much to the American Academy. One of my tasks tonight is to tell you a little bit about who Neil Ferguson is, although I think most of you probably already know quite a bit about him. He is certainly one of the world's most famous and influential historians. He is the Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of History at Harvard, and the William Ziegler Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. He was educated at Oxford, and this is relevant to this audience. He was a Hanseatic scholar, which is a little bit like a German Rhodes Scholarship. He is a specialist in the history of finance and also of empire, and has written many, many books. They include a 2-volume study of the House of Rothschild, a history of the First World War called The Pity of War, and recently a life and times of Zygmunt Warburg, a banker whose philosophy, he said, is the antithesis of the debt-fueled, algorithm-driven banking of our own time. Professor Ferguson is now working on a multi-volume biography of Henry Kissinger. He has a television career. His history of the British Empire was both a book and a 6-part series for Channel 4 in the UK. And Civilization, the book that we're talking about tonight, is also a Channel 4 television series. Somehow he finds time to do what I normally do, which is to write for print publications. He's a contributing editor of the Financial Times, and he writes for Newsweek. He is noted for some of his controversial opinions and positions, both historical and contemporary. The Pity of War argues that the First World War was England's fault. He has had good things to say about Western imperialism, although the book that we're talking about tonight certainly doesn't gloss over the dark side of that phenomenon. He is a practitioner of counterfactual history, so what might have happened if Germany had won the First World War, or if 9/11 hadn't happened. Last month, Professor Ferguson married Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a very well-known Dutch, Somali-born feminist who is now in I guess, exile in the United States, really, because she is also a critic of Islam and faced peril in the Netherlands. Well, I can't really do justice to his career without publishing my own multi-volume biography, so I'm just going to ask you to welcome Neil Ferguson to talk about his latest book, Civilization.
Thank you very much indeed, Brooke, for that eloquent and generous introduction. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and especially a great pleasure to be here in my capacity as a board member of the American Academy and I'm grateful to Gary and all his team for the work that they've done to make this event possible, as well, of course, as being grateful to ESMT. And it would also be wrong for me to omit to thank my publisher, who is here tonight, Christian Seeger, who is responsible with his team for the German edition of my book, which in English has just been published in the United States with the title Civilization, the West and the Rest. Now, if you go into a German bookshop and look for a book called Civilization, Zivilisation, you will be disappointed. And the reason is, as Christian explained to me, we don't really have the word civilization in quite the sense that you mean. We have Kultur, but not so much civilization. This took me back in time to the days when I spent a lot of time researching the history of the First World War. Brooke mentioned my book, The Pity of War, Der falsche Krieg in German, which doesn't exactly blame it all on Britain, but certainly doesn't say it's all Germany's fault either. As I was researching that book, I came across Thomas Mann's great wartime tract, Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen, the reflections of an unpolitical man. And it's in that book that Mann draws the distinction between Civilisation and Kultur. And he argues that that is what the First World War is really about. He argues that it is a contest between the higher spiritual values of German culture and the materialistic civilization of the Anglo-French Entente, which he identifies with commerce and soap and that kind of thing. Well, in many ways, I'm a true representative of the civilization that man despised. And my book is, in many respects, a materialist account of world history since 1400. The aim of the book is, I suppose, to condense into a single volume as much of the history that I find exciting as was possible. My students at Harvard are already, I suspect, wearying of some of the arguments that are in the book, but I hope that they will be fresh and novel to the general reader. It's a history of the world. It covers 600 years. But it's appropriate, since we're in Berlin, to note the quite important role that Germany plays, and the complex role that Germany plays in this book. For example, in the argument of the second chapter, which is centered around the scientific revolution of the 17th century, I take quite a bit of time to explain that it couldn't really have happened the way it did if there had not first been a fundamental breakthrough in the technology of communications with the advent of the printing press, an essentially German phenomenon to begin with. Luther's extraordinary sermons, which were the first true bestsellers in our modern sense, mass-produced with printing presses throughout Central Europe, distributed with extraordinary speed, reaching an unprecedentedly large readership. These are crucial texts, not just for their content, but for their form. A critical point to emerge from that chapter is that when you can read the Bible, or for that matter, a sermon by Luther, you can read anything. And when you can print sermons and scripture, you can print anything. And the revolution in printing, I believe, was one of the great preconditions for the scientific revolution, as well, of course, as for the Enlightenment. There's a vignette in the book. I'm a great believer in the detail that makes you go, gosh. The detail that made me go, gosh, about Luther is that he was asked by the good burgher of Basel if it was proper for a publisher in Basel to print a German translation of the Quran. And there's a wonderful quotation in my book from Luther in which he says, yes, you absolutely must do this. There was a great deal of opposition to the idea. You absolutely must do this, because the best proof of the error of the teaching of Muhammad is there for anyone to read in the Quran. This idea is a revolutionary idea, that we should read not only our own preferred holy texts, but those of other faiths, if only to see why they're wrong. And it's a part of the story that my book is concerned with. The story of the great divergence between the West and the rest. The extraordinary transformation in world history that propelled a minority of human beings, those who lived in or originated in Europe, to a position of astonishing economic, cultural, and geopolitical dominance relative to the majority of humankind. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the big story of modern history. And if you don't have a view on why it happened, you're somewhat missing the point of the last 500 years. In the beginning, if you toured the world in 1411, 600 years ago, before the Reformation, before the revolution of the printing press, before, in a sense, my story begins, you would not have predicted the predominance of the West. You would not have foreseen it. On the contrary, on your world tour, you would have concluded that the future belonged to China, because by far the most sophisticated and advanced civilization in the world in 1411 was that of Ming China. You might also have been impressed by some of the other Oriental civilizations you encountered along the way. The Ottomans hadn't, by that stage, yet conquered Constantinople, but they had a pretty formidable empire already in the Near East. By the time you got to Western Europe, you would have encountered far less impressive monuments to civilization. The cities, and after all, civilization is about cities as the terminology suggests, were small and frankly rather smelly in Western Europe compared with the great cities of the Orient. At a time when, if you look at, say, Nanjing, the early Ming capital, the population of great Oriental cities could exceed 500,000 and ultimately approach 1 million, the population of London was 50,000. 50,000. These European cities were far less impressive. And Europe itself was far less impressive in a whole range of ways. So the point of the book is to explain why this somewhat unpromising part of the world established such an amazing lead over the rest of the world in the 500 or so years after, let's say, 1500. Germany crops up in another part of the answer to the question. The scientific revolution, which I've already mentioned, was a phenomenon not only in the English-speaking world and the French-speaking world, but also in the German as well as the Italian-speaking world. It was an authentically European project in which German scientists and mathematicians made major contributions, not only Newton, also Leibniz. These are the names that loom large in that extraordinary period of scientific innovation, an innovative burst without any counterpart in the rest of the world. And here's a mystery. It wasn't as if the Muslim world was short of mathematical and scientific sophistication. From the vantage point of the Middle Ages, it was in fact the Muslim world that had preserved an advanced scientific knowledge while Europe lay in a post-Roman morass. Why the Ottoman Empire played no role whatsoever in the scientific revolution is one of the puzzles that my book tries to address. They should have done. They were not far away. Distance did not significantly separate Istanbul from the great centers of scientific innovation to the west. Frederick the Great is a character who figures in my book as something of a hero. I contrast Frederick with his contemporary, the Sultan in Istanbul, stuck in the harem, cut off from his subjects, as well as from the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Frederick emerges as a figure of extraordinary complexity and interest. In many ways, a paragon of a new kind of ruler, governing on the basis of rational ideas derived from science, but even more from the Enlightenment. One of the most exciting moments for me of doing this book was reading the original manuscript, Frederick's autograph manuscript of his book Anti-Machiavel, which is here in Berlin, I think, in the archive at Dahlem. I'm beginning to forget which archive I was in. I went to quite a few. This is an amazing document. If you ever wonder what it is that gets historians excited and what makes them different from social scientists, imagine me sitting looking at the original manuscript of Anti-Machiavel and realizing that the editorial annotations, the scrawls, the corrections, the changes, the suggestions are in the hand of Voltaire. What an editor to have. I guess that helps to be a king. It's also an amazing thing to read Frederick's political writing. That manuscript contains one of the most revolutionary articulations of the modern idea of rulership that you will ever come across. In it, Frederick denounces the monarch who throws away the lives of his subjects in wars pursued purely for vainglory. He devotes a whole half page to listing the miseries of war as they affect the ordinary man, woman, and child, and makes it clear that in his ideal, the monarch is the servant of a state, and a state that is there to serve its people. One realizes in reading this just what a revolutionary figure he was, to say nothing of his extraordinarily fierce thoughts on the subject of Christianity. So Germany plays a part in what might be called the light side, the bright side of this story. But also, of course, it illustrates perfectly the shadow side of the history of Western ascendancy. I don't know if you've ever been to Namibia, but when researching civilization, I spent a week there on the trail of the Herero uprising, which was so astonishingly, brutally suppressed by the German imperial forces in the early 1900s. The Herero and the Nama were all but annihilated as peoples. The scale of the violence waged against them is shocking even today. And it's hard not to be moved to stand in the desert, as I did not far from Lüderitz, and see still coming to the surface the bones of the many, many thousands of people who died in what were essentially death camps on the Namibian coast. The links from the colonial project in German Southwest Africa to subsequent much larger atrocities in Europe turn out to be strikingly direct. And in that sense, civilization is concerned to understand the complex links from the realm of power and ideology, colonial dominance, to the great horrors of the mid-20th century, culminating, of course, at Auschwitz. Is it a coincidence that Hermann Göring's father had been governor of Southwest Africa? I think not. Empire, though, is not the key to the story that I want to tell you tonight. Because, you know, although a great deal of scholarship has been devoted to the hypothesis that imperialism was the key to the great divergence of the West from the rest, that seems on reflection a rather implausible argument. Why? Because empire was the least original thing that Western powers did after 1500. It was the thing that all powers had done in all parts of the world from the very beginnings of civilization. And I want to suggest to you this evening that we can't really understand what happened in the years from 1500 to our own time if we lay the emphasis on imperialism and the structure, exploitative and otherwise, of empires. That was not the key to Western ascendancy. Let me briefly summarize the argument of this book. This is not to save you from reading it. It is most certainly not to save you from buying it, which you absolutely must in order to make Herr Seeger happy. And if he's happy, I'm happy. The argument is this. From around 1500 until the late 1970s, the divergence of incomes between the West and the rest was an unstoppable, an extraordinary, and accelerating trend. If in 1500 the average inhabitant of China had been somewhat richer than the average inhabitant of North America, by the 1970s the average American was more than 20 times richer than the average Chinese, and that's allowing for purchasing power parity. In other words, allowing for the fact that a haircut in China is a great deal cheaper than a haircut in the United States. If you don't do that, in 1978, the average American was 70 times richer than the average Chinese. This is what economic historians mean by the Great Divergence. But I try to show that the Great Divergence was about more than just per capita gross domestic product, which is a standard measure of economic income. It was also about, for example, longevity. Europeans, by the early 1900s, had a life expectancy roughly twice what Africans or Asians had, and at times more than double. And in terms of power, consider this. Just 11 countries in 1500, European countries, accounted for maybe 5% of the world's land surface, and at most 10 or 15% of its population, and at most 20% of its collective income. By 1913, these 11 European countries, plus the United States, controlled empires that covered something in the region of 50 to 60% of the world's land surface, about the same proportion of its population, and 3/4 of the total global economy. When we talk about the Great Divergence, in other words, we are discussing not only an economic divergence, but also a political one, a divergence in well-being. Notice also that there was a cultural dominance enjoyed by the West. Even when non-Westerners came to criticize the structures of power that had emerged by, let's say, the early 1900s, they found themselves obliged to do so using Western conceptual apparatus. All the great criticisms of Western civilization that became so potent in the late 19th and early 20th century, nationalism, Marxism, originated from the West itself. And those who struggled against Western oppression, perhaps unwittingly and often perfectly wittingly, did so using Western tools, Western ideologies. How can we explain this extraordinary period of dominance? Well, I try to simplify this argument, and perhaps I do it in a way that a German audience will find objectionable, since it has a certain levity that is almost always absent from academic life in this country. But you must remember, our mission, fellow professors, is to educate young people. And young people do not respond very well to formulations of the form. There were 6 important institutions that determined the Great Divergence of the West from the rest. It's something about that word institutions that just sends a student to sleep. So what I say in the book, and this is partly to catch the attention of my 17-year-old son, is, Felix, there were 6 killer applications. I asked today, what's German for killer application? And it is, of course, killer Applikation. So the killer apps are just my teenager-friendly way of saying the key institutions, because I think institutions are the key. It's not the weather, it's not the geography, it's not the natural resource endowment, it's not national character. Forget all that. The decisive thing, the thing that changes behavior, often very dramatically and very suddenly, is institutions. The killer apps in the book are, first of all, the institutions that promote competition. Unlike the essentially monolithic structure of imperial China, Europe in 1500 was characterized by amazing fragmentation, political fragmentation, intense competition between multiple states, but also competition within those states between more or less autonomous corporate entities. The very notion of a corporation of the City of London, a self-governing body of merchants, the antecedent of our modern corporations, was essentially unknown in that form outside the West. So competition is my first killer app. It was competition that made Vasco da Gama's voyages different in their character from Admiral Zheng He's voyages, earlier in bigger ships, just as geographically far, but economically, in the end, pointless. The second I've already alluded to was the scientific revolution. The great breakthroughs in our understanding of the natural world that happened in the 17th century happened only in the West, and in fact in quite a limited part of the West when you just look at the geography of scientific innovation. Why does this matter? Well, let me give you an example. Benjamin Robbins was an autodidact Quaker mathematician with Newtonian ambitions, good enough to get himself elected to the Royal Society, that great body for the promotion of scientific knowledge. It was Robbins who first formulated an authentic Newtonian theory of ballistics. And Robbins's theory of gunnery, as he called it, very swiftly became the standard work for artillery officers throughout Europe. The key is that if you take Newtonian physics and you look at where projectiles go and how they behave, and then you compensate for air resistance, you make guns accurate. And Europeans, thanks to the scientific revolution, were the first people in the world to have accurate artillery. This was a killer application in the strict sense of the word. And it meant that, of course, from that point on, it was extremely hard to beat European armies equipped with Robbins and modern artillery pieces. So the scientific revolution. The rule of law. You were probably wondering if democracy was one of the killer applications. It's not. It would be very odd if it was, since most Western societies only became democratic quite recently. No, what distinguished Western societies from other societies was the way in which the rule of law evolved to be the central institutional framework within which conflicts were resolved. And this was a rule of law in which private property rights became central. I think this is more true of the English-speaking world than it is of other parts of the West. And certainly the ideal type, if I can use that Weberian term, was John Locke's conception of the rule of law based on private property rights from which personal freedom essentially derived, and on which representation in some representative legislature should be based. This turns out to be a tremendously important killer application when it comes to incentivizing people to accumulate wealth, securing their ownership of wealth in an effective system of law. The fourth killer application I've mentioned, modern medicine. Once you have the great breakthroughs of the 19th and early 20th century to control epidemic disease, you massively increase life expectancy and indeed the quality of life. My fifth killer application is the consumer society. Please put your hand up if you have bought an article of clothing in the last month. Be honest. Be honest, come on. I know this is austere Prussia, but give me a break. The truth is the consumer society was the necessary precondition for the Industrial Revolution. There is no point having an Industrial Revolution, no point at all, if there isn't an infinitely elastic appetite, demand for clothing. That's what it's about. Making the unit price of a cotton shirt fall by 90%. That's pointless if people are happy with just one cotton shirt. but they're not. Just take a look at your teenage daughter's wardrobe, and you will see it's an infinitely elastic demand. And so the consumer society is a killer app. Finally, we come back to Germany. Max Weber. Weber wanted to answer the question that I'm grappling with. And so he went on a trip. He went on a trip to St. Louis, Missouri. And it was there that he got the idea for the Protestant ethic, that great essay, which argues that the Great Divergence is essentially a cultural, indeed a religious phenomenon, and that the behavior of people in the West is different where Protestantism has transformed their work ethic and their thrift ethic. This was Weber's perhaps most famous idea, and it's one that's crept into popular parlance. You hear people talking about the Protestant ethic who've never read Weber or even heard his name. So that is my argument, and I'm sure Brooke and members of the audience will I enjoy tearing it to pieces in the next hour or so. Though I sit down and invite you to join in this discussion, let me take the remaining minutes to pose a couple of questions. The first is it over? Are we living through the end of Western predominance? And I believe the answer is yes. The answer is not only yes in statistical terms, that, for example, China seems very likely to become the largest economy in the world within 5 years, and the great gap between US and Chinese income has gone from being 20 to 1 to just 5 to 1, all in the space of a few decades. It's not just that. It's the obvious, and I hope it's already obvious to you, point that these killer applications I've been describing are no longer monopolized by the West. It turns out that they really are like apps because anyone can download them. It's open source. It's like one of those free apps you get in the App Store. Once non-Western societies understood that this worked, the first to do so was Japan, a process began whereby the institutions that had been developed in the West were downloaded by the rest. It took time. There was a good deal of resistance, even in Japan. But it proved to be an unstoppable process because it worked. Societies that took these institutions succeeded. Those that resisted them remained mired in poverty. So that leads to a second question. Is the end of the Great Divergence, is the Great Reconvergence, something we should worry about? I say we because the majority of people in this room are, and I think would identify themselves as Western, but not everybody. There are clearly, one can tell from their physiognomies, people here who come from non-Western parts of the world, at least originally perhaps their families did. What's to worry about? Should we in fact welcome the end of poverty in the world's most populous countries? Is this a cause for celebration? I think it is. I think it is. What I worry about is not that they are downloading our killer apps. What I worry about is that we are deleting them. The problem is that the Great Reconvergence isn't just about the rest getting it. It's about the West losing it. As I go through the 6 things that I've been describing to you, and I ask myself, how are we doing today? The answer, I find, is troubling in nearly every case. I don't believe that Western economies are truly as competitive as they were before. Indeed, in all kinds of ways, competition is distorted by state intervention and other forms of distortion. I don't believe the West is any longer confidently in command of the scientific revolution. On the contrary, I see evidence that in terms of basic scientific training, Asia is pulling ahead of the West. A simple example, the gap in mathematical attainment at teenage years is now enormous between countries like Singapore, parts of China, Taiwan, and the English-speaking world. The gap between Shanghai and the United States in mathematical literacy at age 15 is as big as the gap between the United States and Albania. Think of that. On the rule of law and protection of private property rights, take a look at the data from the World Economic Forum. It's shocking to find that, for example, the United States is not even in the top 30 in 15 out of 16 measures of security of contract, protection of property, non-corruption, and so forth. I could go on. I think my point is clear. It's not just that they're downloading our apps, it's that we seem somehow to be deleting them. And the challenge that we face in the West, in Germany as much as in the United States, must now be to reinstall these things, to download the updates, to delete the many viruses that now cause our operating system to run so slowly, so inefficiently, and ultimately to reboot our societies. The conclusion that I draw, and I think it's a conclusion that would have appealed to Frederick the Great, is that the choice is not simply between decline and revival. It's more dramatic than that. It's between a reboot or a system crash. And on that note, I'll thank you very much indeed for your listening. Okay, Brooke.
Well,
over to you.
You invited me to tear apart your thesis, but I think I'm going to decline that particular invitation. No, I wanted to say first of all that I have no stake in making your publisher happy. I read the book. I enjoyed it immensely. I guess among the things that impressed me was, very much as a book based on an understanding of economics, an understanding of the way societies work, and so you're dealing with those rather slow-moving, static concepts of history, and yet it has a kind of a narrative drive, and it's full of personality that makes it, just great fun to read. So, from a very unbiased position, I do recommend it very, very strongly. It was terrific.
But?
You really want me to have a go at you? No, I'm actually what I'm going to try and do actually is explore more. If I might provoke you a little bit, but I'm going to really try and explore more the implications of some of the things that you talked about. And maybe let me just start by asking you if you talked at the end about this divergence that we're seeing. It's sort of a re-divergence now with the non-West rising and the West falling. And I wondered if dominance, if this divergence continues, will dominance mean the same thing in the future, the next 500 years, that it has in the past 500 years? Or have these non-Western countries downloaded our apps to the extent that it sort of makes it safe for this divergence to occur, if you see what I mean? I mean, the rule of law, particularly international law, will that constrain the behavior of rising powers? And is that, therefore, a reason for us to worry less about what's happening?
This is a great question. I think in some respects, the forms of dominance, and we know that dominance exists. If you doubted it, I think take a look at the picture of the head of the EFSF bowing and scraping in Beijing in the hope of raising 100 billion euros here or there from the Chinese. I mean, dominance in some respects takes classical forms today. The dominance that comes from being a creditor has a certain perennial familiarity to it. And as the United States in particular has become the world's debtor, China has become the world's creditor. And that gives you power. Britain had that power 100 years ago. Britain was 100 years ago the world's banker. The United States had that power in the interwar and post-war period. And in that sense, it will, I think, be a familiar story. Those $3 trillion of international reserves that the People's Republic of China disposes of gives a great deal of power to people in Beijing. In other forms, in other ways, dominance is familiar too. I spent some of my time in Zambia when I was doing the book, and on a more recent research trip to look at China's informal empire in Africa, which is a fascinating phenomenon and a complex phenomenon, not to be caricatured. The Chinese find themselves in Africa for many of the same reasons that Europeans were there 100 years ago. It's where the copper is, at least quite a lot of it. And watching the Chinese grapple with the challenges of managing large mineral extracting facilities in a pretty unfamiliar environment with a completely culturally different population is a little bit like seeing a repeat of late 19th century imperialism, though the Chinese are very keen to deny that. You have to remind them that other empires have been acquired in a fit of absence of mind. You don't need to mean to get an empire. It can happen to you simply by accident because you're there trying to get the copper out. But there's a new twist to this tale, I think. And that goes directly to the issue of killer apps and my software analogy. The world is profoundly different because of technology. I don't think one can overstate that point. The degree of interconnectedness is unprecedented. The extent to which information flows faster and in greater volumes than ever before is truly staggering. And here, it turns out, new forms of dominance or perhaps anti-dominance are possible. If there's one thing that makes me worried and makes me think that a dramatic change in the balance of power could happen, it is the prospect of cyber attack on Western societies. They are vulnerable to it, and there is no question that these attacks are being planned and carried out. And those who are in the know about this stuff really are extremely concerned about the scale of the problem and the difficulty that we have in combating it. So in that sense, there's a novel side to it. It doesn't give me a huge amount of hope that the new powers will feel tremendously constrained by formal international legal conventions. There's certainly not much sign of those being adhered to in the cyberspace area.
So you think that empire, almost in a traditional sense, sort of using new technologies, could return? I mean, we could have an expansionist China.
It never went away. I mean, the thing about empire is that it gets relabeled periodically, but empires are like the poor. They're always with us. They are a perennial feature of human history since recorded history began. They changed the labels, particularly during the Cold War, when both empires accused the other of imperialism, but in practice, to anybody on the receiving end of the exercise of Soviet power in let's say, Africa, or in American power in, let's say, Central America, didn't feel a whole lot different from the old self-confident, self-proclaiming imperialism of the 19th century. So I don't think empire is the key. As I said, I don't think it's really that powerful an explanatory variable because it's so consistently a feature. I'm more interested in the concept of civilization, which in a sense is a bigger, more nebulous thing, because there's a really interesting point that struck me as I was writing the book. You'll probably be familiar with Samuel Huntington's argument about the clash of civilizations. I still think the most insightful thing to be written about the post-Cold War world, even if you didn't agree with it. It's actually stood up a lot better than Francis Fukuyama's End of History and any other model that was tried in the 90s. The thing that Huntington, I think, got wrong was the assumption that civilizations essentially do clash or have a tendency to clash. What strikes me as I work on the notion of civilization is how much the fusion tends to dominate the fission. And the interesting thing that happens as civilizations encounter one another is that they don't necessarily end up in conflict. Quite often, you see a kind of fusion occurring. And so what I'm fascinated by as I look at the world today is the sense that instead of the chain of McDonald's that people maybe expected the world to become back in the late 80s, we now see ourselves in an enormous Asian fusion restaurant. That is to say, much of the non-Western is being retained, particularly in the realm of culture, even as the institutions of the West dominate. And I think that's one of the paradoxes of our time. People do things in a Western way, in all kinds of dimensions. They live in more Western accommodation. They wear more Western clothes in most places in the world. They live more Western lifestyles. They have Western working hours. Their lives become outwardly Western. They drive around the way we do and get stuck in traffic the way we do. And all of this looks like Westernization, except that within these institutions, much that is non-Western remains. And that's, to me, the really fascinating thing, and why studying civilizations is in some ways more satisfying than studying empires.
You say at the very end of the book that, and you made a similar point in your talk, that the important thing for us is really to re-embrace these killer applications. I think you say at one point that the biggest threat to Western civilization is our own pusillanimity.
Horrible word to say that.
It would have been easier if you'd said, cowardice, but
that's a word that needs to be kept going.
Pusillanimity. And what I wanted to ask about that is, in order to do that, are you suggesting that we need to sort of re-embrace values and institutions that we all sort of fundamentally accept and share and agree on, and that there's some kind of failure of will or failure of institutional competence that's preventing us from doing that? Or are you saying, or is this basically a political question? I mean, is there an ideological battle to be fought within the West that will allow us to sort of reclaim these institutions?
Well, you know I'm not pusillanimous about these things.
I was counting on it.
I think that the emphasis should be on institutions. And I think one can recognize the value of good institutions in the incentives that they give people without necessarily needing to be doctrinaire about values. And my hope is that we can find common ground on these questions, whether we consider ourselves to be conservative, liberal, or to the left of liberal. Because there's a sense in which this is not beyond the realm of empirical verification. Bad institutions can have a very dramatic impact on behavior. And when I want to try to explain to an American audience what I mean by how institutions matter, I say we ran these experiments, and we ran one of them right in this city. We took a homogeneous population of Berliners, and we gave one half of them one set of institutions, and the other half another set of institutions. We did the same for the whole of Germany, and with amazing speed, behavior changed and outcomes diverged. Even although the people were essentially the same people. We did the same in Korea, and the results were even more extreme in terms of outcomes. So I have this fundamental belief that institutions matter, and it should not be an entirely politicized debate about how you get the incentives to be better, whether it comes to getting your students to work harder or getting bureaucrats to be less corrupt, which is a huge issue in much of the developing world. I think we ought to be able to get some consensus on this kind of thing because much of it is academically, empirically verifiable. Nevertheless, there is a political dimension to it. What I'm saying is we need to recognize, first of all, what institutions really worked to make the West still the richest part of the world. It's still the case that 19% of, I mean, we talk a lot about inequality in the US these days and elsewhere, but look at the global picture. If you do a calculation on global holdings of private wealth, 19% of the population living in the West own still today 66% of the private wealth. That's the legacy of the Great Divergence. This will take some considerable time to change. We need to figure out why we're so much better off, why it was that our fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, not to mention their wives, essentially bequeathed us this extraordinary wealth. And until we understand that properly, until we have a good account of our own history, we're not going to get what really matters. So the idea about competition is, I think, important because you need to recognize that having a highly dynamic, competitive economic and political system is very good. Not everybody accepts that. Not everybody accepts the importance of competition. I'll give you a simple example, just one. There is a strong predisposition to favor monopoly in education. It is hard to persuade even quite centrist people in the United States that having monopolistic public education is a bad idea, especially at the high school level. Why are American teenagers much worse at math than their counterparts in other countries? Because the public schools are not good. And why are they not good? Because there's a huge monopoly there in which competition plays no role. Why are the American universities the best in the world? Because there's a lot of competition in the university sector. So competition's important, and not everybody accepts that. Many people see the downside of competition, the fact that some people do badly, as fundamentally a problem. And I think one of the reasons that Western societies are performing less well is that gradually we have created a whole series of constraints, buffers, cushions, safety nets. We've wrapped the economy in red tape because we don't really want to live with the reality of what competition means. That notion of creative destruction, which Joseph Schumpeter rightly emphasized as being at the heart of capitalism, has wildly fallen out of fashion. Now everything is too big to fail. Nobody can go bust, the costs are too high, nobody can really be sacked without an enormously complex process, and so on. So I think when you take the killer applications one by one, you start with a strong empirical basis. You say, look, this really does seem to correlate to improved performance. These institutions seem to work, but you inevitably end up in a political argument. In my case, most recently with the teachers' unions, or with Jeff Sachs, who passionately believes that America's problems can be solved by increasing federal government expenditure, increasing the number of federal government programs, and raising taxation. I think this is completely at variance with the historical experience, but there he is, he believes it, and people believe him.
But, well, I said I wasn't going to sort of go at you, but let me just, on this point, I mean, because I think this does raise the issue of perhaps why it is so difficult to know how to sort of at least retain our edge, as it were. And that is, a lot of people would say that much of what you just said, even within the Western world, doesn't necessarily hold true. I mean, if you look at I'm not an expert on the Finnish education system, but they're at the top of the sort of the league tables, and as far as I know, there's no competition in the Finnish education system. I don't think that I would be surprised if there were a competition in the Shanghai school system as well, but I might be wrong about that. But that sort of underlines the idea that all of these issues are highly disputable, even if we accept your fundamental view, which is that these institutions are very important and have to be preserved. I mean, people will look at Scandinavia, or they'll look at Germany, and they'll say, these countries have huge welfare states and relatively high taxation, and they're very successful. So how do you deal with that?
No, this is a really important question, because there's a whole different range of ways in which competition operates. I mean, competition within the classroom is extremely important. Competition within the teaching profession is extremely important. Competition to attract teachers, all of these things are part of the story. I don't want to make it sound as if I just think all you need is a large number of charter schools and you solve the problem in the US. I think there's a very big difference in the way that the teaching profession operates in Scandinavia, in the way that it's organized in Scandinavia as compared with the US, where I think a really major problem has developed, that it's genuinely impossible to sack bad teachers because of the power of the teachers' unions. And that's a very major obstacle to the kind of competition I am talking about. I would be very surprised if that were the case in Scandinavian schools, that I'm perfectly prepared to be told that I'm wrong about that. But I think the critical issue here is to look at the ways in which the incentives work. What we care about most is getting people to compete in the classroom and getting teachers to compete with one another to do the best possible job. It's when that stops working that you have a problem. If you can get a public sector to produce the goods, fine. But I can't imagine that you're doing that without any element of competition. Then you look at the university situation in Europe and you realize that there's another side to this story. What has worked well at the level of high school education has worked disastrously at the level of university education. Look at the league table of universities around the world. There are various different ways of calculating this. The performance of the state sector, those countries which have essentially a national university service, is really poor. So I think one has to recognize that there's a really interesting institutional question here. And the question is this: what is best practice? In healthcare? In education? What is best practice in the law? And it's interesting to me that relatively little work goes into those sorts of questions. And relatively little discussion, certainly in the United States, revolves around which healthcare system would we rather have than this one. The debate is never framed like that. And yet that's the only rational way for us to proceed. If you take the comparative global perspective, which I've tried to take, you get to at least ask the right question and you get to the right kind of data.
Let me ask you to go counterfactual for a moment. This may be a slightly mischievous counterfactual. I'm not even sure I should ask it, but I mean, you talk in your book about how civilizations can collapse quite suddenly. And you also talk about the importance of sound fiscal management as a way of preserving one's economic and ultimately cultural and military strength. And I wondered whether if on 9/11 you had had a fiscally conservative, maybe militarily conservative Democrat like Al Gore in the White House rather than what you had, whether we would be looking at quite a different world at the moment.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because a central part of my methodology as an historian is to pose explicitly counterfactual questions of the form, what if? And I have to tell you that when I first began to do this, the most staunch resistance to the very principle of the counterfactual question came from the German historical profession, where it is still, generally speaking, the orthodoxy that such questions lie outside the purview of serious academic history. And I want to take this opportunity to tell this audience that that position is completely wrong and philosophically bankrupt. It's philosophically bankrupt for at least 3 reasons. One, we live in a world in which the natural world itself is characterized by a certain chaotic and non-linear, unpredictable quality. And so the reality of history is there's a lot of randomness out there, even in the success of your harvest, if you're a farmer, which most people through the history of civilization have tended to be. The second reason is that in a law court, any statement of the causal nature, any statement of a causal form, such as, if it hadn't been for George W. Bush, the world would be a better place. Or rather, George W. Bush was to blame for all the problems of the world today, implies the counterfactual that if he hadn't become president, we'd all be sitting pretty and everything would be fine and there would be peace and love and harmony throughout the Middle East. It's implicit, this counterfactual, in any statement of a causal nature. And it's always struck me as very bizarre that professional historians duck out of making their counterfactuals explicit. The final thing is that we can't, as historians, understand the thought processes of people in the past, which is really what historians try to do, if we don't understand the alternatives that they contemplated at the time. And that's a preamble to answering your question. If Gore had become president, which he might well have done, given the extraordinary closeness of that election and the extreme controversy surrounding its ultimate outcome, would he have reacted differently to the 9/11 attacks? Probably he would. I don't think, for example, that he necessarily would have scrambled special forces and insisted on the overthrow of the Taliban regime. We know from the evidence that we have so far that that was very much Bush's initiative, and the CIA didn't want it, and the Defense Department didn't want it, but he just said, you damn well do it. So even before we get to 2003, I think we have a different history. And not necessarily a better history, because it seems to me that the overthrow of the Taliban was a good thing. The bad thing was the failure to follow through with any serious attempt at nation building until years later, when much of the damage had already been done. Would Gore have overthrown Saddam? No. I think that's clear. Would the world be a better place? I'm going to say something that's going to enrage at least half of you. And that's what I'm here to do. I think we will look back 10 years from now and realize that what we are calling the Arab Spring is a direct consequence of the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. And that in his modesty, and I know this because I heard him speak just a few days ago, former President Bush does not lay claim to the credit for what we are seeing. He could. I can think of many a former president who wouldn't have been able to resist it. He doesn't, and yet, the more time I spend talking to people from the region, the more time I spend in the region, and I spent quite a bit of time there because the Middle East plays a big part in the story, Jerusalem plays a big part in civilization, the more I begin to see that more than anything else, it was the sight of Saddam Hussein emerging from his hole, bedraggled and bearded, and then hanging, that emboldened the people of that region to overthrow the dictators. I do not believe that if we had let Saddam sit tight and confined ourselves to years and years of sanctions and no-fly zones, that anything that we are currently seeing, Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere, would be happening. And that is why history works in an intriguing way. Our snap judgments on the recent past are nearly always wrong. Journalism isn't the first draft of history, it's the wrong draft of history, with all due respect to your profession. And the historian's job is to come along and say, you know what? The economists got this wrong. Bush was a terrific president, and he did the right things, unpopular though they were, in order to transform that region.
The fiscal question is...
Well, you know how critical I've been of the fiscal policy of the Bush administration. That's a separate issue. Could they have financed those wars in a more responsible way? Yes. Should they have done? Yes.
Okay, I think I probably have to, or not have to, want to let other people ask questions. Can I ask just one very quick last question, then I'll kind of throw it open. And that is about Germany, which you know pretty well. I mean, Germany seems to be kind of a shining example of almost exceptionalism to this sort of relative Western decline. I mean, sort of in economic terms, it's quite Chinese-like with its high savings rate, high investment, high big budget surplus, not budget, trade surplus, very competitive industry. And I wonder if I mean, first of all, do you accept the idea that there's a sort of a German economic exceptionalism in this way? And if so, I mean, how do you explain it? And is there something that other countries can learn from it?
Well, I'll be brief because I do want to bring in the audience. I think if you look back 10 or 20 years, there was a great deal of soul-searching in this country about whether the Wirtschaftswunder was over. And indeed, I can remember reading many articles about all the terrible things that were going wrong with the German system. And in some ways, I think what Germany illustrates is that it is perfectly possible to reboot a system, that you really can actually turn things around if you recognize that there is a problem. And I do think that German industry did this, that in the wake of German reunification, which of course was as big a fiscal shock to Germany as in many ways Bush's wars have been to the United States, there was a concerted effort to get the house in order. The problem was that as Germany pursued efficiency gains and productivity gains in its manufacturing sector, it left the rest of Europe behind, or rather the rest of Europe failed to keep up. And if one wants to understand the crisis in the Eurozone today, it isn't really about whether the Greek debt is too large or even whether the French banks are bust. It's really about a divergence in competitiveness, which is mainly to do with German improvement and the failure of the rest of Europe to keep up. So I think this is really quite a cheering story in some respects. I'm not saying in this book, oh, the West is doomed. It's not one of those Spengler-type lamentations. On the contrary, what I'm saying is, these institutions work. Could we make sure that they work? Could we get them to work better? And I think Germany illustrates that with a certain amount of will, that can be done. The days when people worried about the end of it all, the decline of the Bundesrepublik, seem very distant today.
Okay, well, now I'm going to ask whoever would like to do what I've just been doing. Yeah. I think you probably should, yes.
Hi, I just had a question with regard to where technology plays a role in this. I mean, ultimately, you've been discussing the balance of power and how the shift will influence the politics of the world. There seems to be this illusion amongst young people, particularly in Silicon Valley, when they're developing technologies, that, you know, once you have this suite of 6 apps that you've been talking about, that there's inevitably going to be a 7th app, which is this global community where everybody's on Facebook and swapping recipes. But at the end of the day, we're one species, and our children and the grandchildren will be the same species. And ultimately, this will, I think, dictate how people act under the shift of power. And my question is this a naivety? And ultimately, do you not see that the shift of power will result in some kind of military conflict within the next century?
Thanks. Well, the number of issues that you've raised there. I was recently debating with Yuri Milner, who's one of the most successful investors in the technology space. And his argument was essentially the one that you've summarized. We enter a new paradise of connectivity, that everybody is networked and everybody's online all the time, and 7 billion people are on Facebook. And this is great. He even says, you know, we end up with a mega brain because we're all connected, and it's like a supercomputer of the human race. And it's true that many people in the business take similar messianic views of what technology can do. I've heard similar things from Jeff Bezos of Amazon and the great Eric Schmidt of Google. I mean, people I really do respect. And I can understand their almost evangelical fervor for the internet and all that goes with it. But there is a problem, which I don't think they're being quite candid enough about. When networks are very, very large and optimized, there are big positive externalities for sure. We can all share recipes to our heart's content and find the perfect recipe, you know, for bratwurst. But the downside is that there's a vulnerability. And very complex, large networks have this propensity to crash. And that's why I talk a lot about complexity in the conclusion of the book. And I say, look, think of civilization as a complex, adaptive system. And it behaves just like that. It's very close to the edge of chaos most of the time, and it doesn't take a big perturbation to send it over. I worry that our giant Facebook network is vulnerable to that kind of thing, whether an endogenous shock or the kind of malicious shock that could come from a serious cyber attack. So I'm much, much less of an optimist than Milner and these other tech guys. I don't think that conflict is hardwired into our future. I don't think that there is some kind of law of history that says, oh, at some point the Chinese challenge to the US will be too great and they'll reenact British and German history. I mean, a lot of people do take that view. Henry Kissinger, in his most recent book on China, concludes by saying it's 1914 all over again if we're not careful. I think that's the right attitude to take. We do have to be very careful. And the United States and China have to do everything possible to avoid a 1914 type scenario. That's called learning from history, and as you may have guessed, I'm in favor of it.
Okay. Gary, did you, John, sorry.
Right down at the front.
Down at the front, yeah.
My esteemed colleague, board privilege.
Well, I look forward to reading your book, which I haven't, but the way you described it leads to many, many provocative thoughts, and so that's good right away. I'm going to make a couple of comments which question some of those thoughts. the question that which is really in front of us are not many of the ones that you put, if I may argue, but this question of connectivity. I don't know what it means, but it certainly is a revolutionary thing, which is going to change the way people behave, the way people connect with each other, the way a country like China develops. China is going to be the first country that develops in the interconnected world, the first big country. If you go out to Western China, there's a city whose name I'm unfortunately now forgotten, which has 5 or 6 Western regional communications centers. The Maersk shipping line of Denmark, Accenture, IBM, Allianz. I mean, China is already interconnected in a way that most of us can't even imagine. And so I just think, not that I disagree with any of your concerns, but I just think we do in fact have to learn new paradigms. It's not Facebook. That's nice and everything, but it's something much deeper. These people who run these things measure things in milliseconds, something we can't even get our heads around. So I just think we're coming in fact, into a new paradigm. I think you also, again, I don't know, I haven't read the book, may sell the United States short. If there's a country which is coming into a new paradigm now, it's not just China, it's the United States. 20 years from now, we're no longer going to be a European country. We have the largest immigration of people from the Indian subcontinent. Major American universities send recruiters to India to find students. The large Latino population, which is coming to our country, which is causing political unrest in some places, as it usually does when such large populations come, is going to bring a whole new kind of creativity to the country. I think that you got to put the United States in this other group. We started as Lutherans, but we're now going to be something much different. And our country is going through major upheavals now about it. But, you know, maybe just being too patriotic, but I think that we will come out in an amazing new identity, which is going to give all these people a run for their money. The question really is not that. The question is, can we, with our Western values, run this connectivity? And can the United States, with its dynamism, understand how to run the connectivity? And I don't think anybody knows.
Well, thanks. I wouldn't be teaching at Harvard as opposed to Oxford, or I wouldn't be on the board of the American Academy, and this is with all due respect to the British ambassador, if I didn't basically agree with you that the prospects for the United States are brighter than they are for the rest of the West. And that's partly for the reason that you give, and also because I think if one actually asks born and bred Americans, they retain a stronger sense of what really matters and what is institutionally healthy than Europeans do. The problem is that the default setting among Europeans is, there is a problem, the state should fix it. Until it's fixed, I'm going to whine. And the American attitude is fundamentally different. And that's clear from opinion poll surveys, and it's one of the other reasons that I have a certain confidence. I still think of Winston Churchill's great line about the United States, and it's worth remembering that the United States will always do the right thing when all the alternatives have been exhausted. And I sometimes feel we are sort of going through the alternatives. Finally, we'll get to the right thing. But let me take the 2 points very briefly. The book is very much concerned with networks and how, beginning with the Reformation and then the Scientific Revolution, it was network effects that made Europe forge ahead. And not being online during the Scientific Revolution meant that the Ottoman Empire was doomed. It couldn't possibly win. And so this is very much a theme in the book. And towards the end, I talk a lot about what the internet means for China, because it is, in fact, China's Reformation moment. It's the moment when you get massive horizontal communication. For the first time, it's not really possible for the state to control it. I was in China in August, just after the big Wenzhou high-speed train crash. There were literally tens of millions of microblog posts, essentially blaming the crash on corrupt officials. There was nothing that could be done to stop that. That is a potentially revolutionary change, though I don't think it's the kind of revolution people in the West expect, because the Chinese definitely don't want that kind of revolution. But it is, you're right, it's going to change China in a big way. On the question of where the United States is going, in the chapter on property rights, I talk a lot about that question by comparing North and South, looking at the United States and looking at Latin American countries, which went down a completely different route, mainly because at no point was a Lockean approach taken to property rights. Hardly anybody owned property, just a tiny elite. And the result was incredible prolonged periods of conflict and poverty. And that period of South American history is coming to an end. Let me try a different idea on you, John. I think what we're seeing is that the United States is becoming a Latin American country. It's becoming a Latin American country in good ways.
Ethnically it is.
Absolutely. By 2050, the non-Hispanic whites will be a minority. And that is changing. You don't need to spend too long in California to see that, or in Texas to see that. That is changing the society in ways that are good, but it is also having an effect that I see in American politics that troubles me. If there's one thing that worries me about the United States, it is the sense that a certain Latin American quality has crept in to life in Washington, D.C. And that what were once high standards of public life are no longer high. And that the power of vested interests and of lobbyists is more redolent of Buenos Aires than of the Boston Tea Party. That's the downside. Because if there's one thing that's really clearly not working well in the US right now, it's the political system. And if the political system doesn't work, I don't see how the US makes the right calls on these big questions.
I just wanted to follow up on the last two questions. Well, you've given me a lot of reasons to read the book, but I still have some fundamental questions about the kinds of institutions that you think about in the future. Just like I agree with you that one should look at the rule of law instead of democracy, but I disagree with you about networking and some of the other proposals that were made, because if I think about your most important institutions or apps, then two things occur to me. One, they have a normative underpinning. Think about democracy versus the rule of law. And there's also a big question about who decides. So my first point would be that I think that the major issue that we're skirting around in the first place is who decides the institutions of global governance in the coming decades. That's going to be, and there will be definitely normative consensus will be necessary in that case. As dysfunctional as our Congress is at the moment, that's not really that relevant to these larger questions, because they'll be decided in the consensus will come about based on a kind of cultural, normative point of view. And I think, I would say instead of networking, which is not a moral category, openness. I think the great app, the killer app, the one that has us debating and it's not cyber war. That's just one consequence of openness. It's openness, because openness has a moral force. By the way, a moral force that a Chinese society or political culture, as long as it retains vestiges of authoritarianism, will not be able to manage in the way that Western society will at least try to manage what is perhaps unmanageable.
So I kind of agree with that, Gary, but I would say let's be more precise when we use a word like openness. What exactly do we mean, and where did that come from? So initially what we mean is what Luther said, let's publish the Quran and it'll be damned when people read what's in it. And that's sort of phase one. Phase two is very important in the scientific revolution. Everybody has to publish their findings. You have to put it up, you have to put it out there, and there's a race. And getting it out first means you're the winner, but you have to get it out. So the openness becomes the sharing of knowledge. That was a very distinctive feature of the scientific revolution, and it did away with the notion of the philosopher's stone, the secret alchemist trying to crack the code and then monopolize the knowledge. And then the third crucial thing, this city has seen both its apotheosis and its nemesis, is tolerance. You essentially say, well, I don't agree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And I think one of the most impressive things about Frederick's reign and the city that he built just around here was that notion that absolutely anybody could come and live in Berlin. Berlin was one of the great cosmopolitan cities of the 18th century world. It had a very large Huguenot community. It had a very large Jewish community. There were even some Muslims here. It's that I think you're getting at. So we go through a series of things, publish and be damned, share your damned information, and then tolerate the conclusions that others come to. And I think the book explains exactly where those things come from and why they happen where they happen. And that's why I'm kind of leery of abstract words like openness. I really want to know which institutions deliver that openness. And there are a whole bunch of others. I mean, one could go on. We're in an educational institution. We're privileged to be here. Educational institutions play a very important role in this story. And usually somebody says at some point, oh, education is a killer app. I'm surprised it hasn't happened tonight. But actually, no, because all societies have educational institutions. The Chinese had an enormously elaborate system of education, but it did not promote the kind of diversity of opinion, the conflict-driven dialectical method that became so important in Western universities. So it's a lot to do, I think, once again, with the institutions that make openness a meaningful, practicable policy in the public sphere and in the realm of education.
I think I have time for a couple. I see more hands than I think I can accommodate. But,
you could do short answers.
Short answers. So Ambassador
Multiple
McDonald
choice.
is next, up here in front.
You talked about Europe and Europe's dominance over the last 5 centuries. But I wonder if it's, you could confine it a little bit. Maybe it's really not 11 countries, but it's Western Europe.
Yeah.
Or maybe, because I'm the British ambassador in Germany, you really mean Germany, Britain, and perhaps Florence.
I grappled with this question. It's obviously the case that Britain becomes a primus inter pares because it has by far the biggest empire after the 7 Years' War and continues to have the biggest empire right down until the 1950s. And so one can't tell this story and sort of leave Britain out. And I don't want to give the impression that it's mostly about Germany. It's not. I mean, it's designed to be even-handed. The Belgium played a pretty inglorious part, and it doesn't get a huge amount of coverage. So no, this is not a story of 11 or 12 equals at all. They played very different roles. But it isn't just Western Europe, and that's really a very important point that I want to emphasize. When you think about what Russia was, the story of Russia's empire, Russia's expansion southwards into the Caucasus and eastwards right all the way to Vladivostok, in many ways it was a story of Western empire in Asia. It just went overland rather than oversea. And when you watch what is happening with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and then the strains in the Russian Federation today, you realize that you're really looking at the last of the great Western empires. And when you go to Kazan, what you see is a colonial situation. There are Russians and Tatars, and that's a real imperial setting. How much longer that remnant of European empire exists is a good question. Mr. Putin clearly wants to keep it going for as long as possible and maybe go back to the good old days when it extended even further west. But I do think the East European story is really a part of the story. And Prussia, when it existed, exemplified that in the sense that it connected the world of the Rhineland to Kant in Königsberg. I bet you didn't know that Kant's grandfather was a Scotsman. That's why he was so clever.
Okay, I think I'm going to take two more, I think, very, very quick ones. And I saw somebody over there.
Well, I'm one of the few non-Westerners.
Welcome.
And allow me the minority view to say that I found the title of your book still as if you're trying to talk West and avoid the rest, and therefore civilization, the West and the rest. Appeared to me a little derogatory, I don't know why. The second comment is about your 6 killer apps, where you, in particular, I don't know, I sense that you are insisting on one of the institutions which you call as competition, which probably, in your estimation, is the main institution which has brought affluence to the Western world, and probably is responsible for material success. But now that the power is slipping away from Western world, and even in your statements, I did sense that we have to regain power as West. That's what probably you were saying. But now that we are seeing some new institutions after the financial crisis, let me name one of the institutions which we call as G20. And previously we had G7, which actually was a core institution of Western world. Don't you see that the institutions or the 6 apps that you proposed now need some adaptation, where G7 has to become G20, or there has to be more need for cooperations? How do we factor those new developments in your hypothesis?
Well, let me first say that the title of the book is in no sense intended to be derogatory, and the argument of the book in no sense is for a kind of Western reconquista of the world. Quite the opposite. I mean, I actually make it very clear that I'm the biggest enthusiast for the transformation of the great populous countries of the East. Nothing cheers me more than to go to India today and see a country which, when I first visited it, was manifestly stagnant, now growing in leaps and bounds. One sees a spring in the step of the average Indian, and it's a wonderful thing to see. And that's a world I really am happy to live in. I have no nostalgia, none whatsoever, for the days when Indians were living in poverty under the rule of a tiny British elite. This is a massive, massive improvement. So the idea of calling it the West and the rest was just to try to capture this fundamental dichotomy that characterized the last 500 or so years, that there was this minority of people who got into a much better position, and what we're living through is an end to that. And one can't really find a snappier way of conveying that, given that it's as true of Brazil as it is of India or China. So, you know, the question of institutions at the international level is a really difficult one. We have, somebody mentioned earlier, maybe it was Gary, world government. We've experimented with different structures for world government since Woodrow Wilson came up with the idea of a League of Nations, with mixed results. It should be said, though not entirely bad results. I'll give you one really good example where world government works. One reason we have not seen a lapse back into protectionism, as happened in the 1930s since the financial crisis, is that the World Trade Organization is a very powerful body that can slap down a protectionist tariff with extraordinary speed and effectiveness. And that is one reason when the United States Congress starts to talk about punitive tariffs on China, you know it's BS, because they would never get away with it. And that's good. Few international institutions have the kind of teeth that the WTO has. One lesson of the financial crisis is that we do not have a WTO-like institution for international capital flows. And in some ways, that's why the financial crisis happened, if you really dig down. Nobody was really doing anything to stop these huge reserve accumulations in China and the flow of money from Asia into the United States property market. It was a completely unregulated phenomenon. Nobody could control it. Whether we can get to a World Trade Organization for capital flows, I don't know, but there's not much sign of it happening. The problem with the G20, finally, is that it's a body in which the conflicting interests of emerging and developed countries will become more and more apparent each time it meets. It did well, it did remarkably well in the worst of the crisis in early '09. Since then, it's become less and less effective as a body, and I think that reflects the fundamental conflict of interests that now exists especially between commodity exporters and commodity importers. We haven't talked much tonight about natural resources. It's a huge part of the story of our future, as big, I think, as the complexities of Facebook and its ilk. There are finite natural resources. Let's not kid ourselves. If everybody in the world consumed natural resources at half the lifetime rate of the average American, we would run out of a great many minerals within an amazingly short time. All the copper in the world would be gone in 28 years, if that happened, 28. And that's actually one of the more bountifully available metals. So I think conflicts over resources, including ultimately water, worry me as much as conflicts over cyberspace. And they're one reason why I think the G20 is going to become an extremely unwieldy body in the years to come.
Okay, I'll take one more.
Everybody's itching to go. When are they going to get a drink?
I'm not going to let them.
Really short. Well, I have to tell my story about the last great Berlin question and answer I did. We had been going for an hour or maybe an hour and a half. And I was just praying for it to end. Es war auf Deutsch, ich war sehr müde. And finally, the moderator said, ja, noch eine Frage. Ja, die letzte Frage. And an elderly gentleman stood up and he said, ich habe nur 9 Punkte. So if anybody here says, I've only got 9 points to make, also, welcome back.
Ein Punkt bitte und dann Schluss.
Thank you for your talk. When you talked about the rule of law, it's hard for me to fill that up with meaning without referring to values and ethics. So I'm wondering, how much did our Western values and ethics play into the ascendance of the West? And if you could say something to that.
Well, this is a great and difficult question that you've posed. Anybody who spends time with lawyers knows that they have no values and no ethics, especially divorce lawyers. Let's just start with that subgroup. No, to be serious, I think there is an important distinction to be drawn between what I mean when I talk about the rule of law, which is a complex, process-driven, case-based approach to conflict resolution with significantly different models available within the Western world. I mean, big differences exist between the English, the French, and the German approaches. That's really what I'm concerned about when I talk about the rule of law. What you've raised are the whole issue of the value system and the ethical system, which in the West was essentially Christian. And although people try to muddy the waters, and Sam Huntington did this by talking about a Judeo-Christian civilization, I don't buy that. That's a real sort of anachronism, which is at odds with most of Western history. So the values and ethics that characterized Western civilization should be acknowledged to be Christian. Of course, there were varieties, and we don't need to go into that. A huge question is whether those values and ethics associated with the teaching of Jesus Christ differ in some important and significant way from the teachings of other religions. For example, the religion that my dear wife has criticized, Islam. Is Christianity a killer app? Was that what gave the West the edge? Before one concludes that it was, there's a problem. And the problem is one of timing. Because the West had Christianity for a long time and remained completely backward and poor. And so the post-Roman period, when you go from the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century all the way, 1,000 years, to 1500, in that period, the Europeans are Christians, but boy, they don't get very far. They really don't get very far with it. In fact, they're far too busy fighting one another to really make the kind of advances that were going on in the Muslim world and in the Confucian Chinese world at that time. And probably that's why I don't lay huge amounts of emphasis on those ethics and values. Not that they don't matter in general, but I suspect they don't matter in the very materialistic model of history that I'm selling here.
But isn't Christianity after the Reformation your sixth hand?
Well, so the ambassador is quite correct to point out that Christianity plays an important part in my book, and I pull a fast one on the reader by saying the most amazing thing going on in China today is actually the growth of Christianity, and particularly evangelical Christianity. So let me just reinforce this point. Christianity changes with the Reformation because it becomes an agency for the spread of literacy. As soon as you emphasize the ability to read Scripture as the fundamental religious act, you create a completely new ballgame in which everyone is incentivized to be literate. And there's some fascinating work on this that's been done by a young American political scientist, sociologist named Woodbury, who shows that from the moment the Reformation kicks in, there is a really close connection between the spread of literacy and economic development. Where Protestant missionaries go, he got it right down to quite small localities, there is an impact, and the impact is entirely a function of their efforts to translate vernacular languages into written words and then print those words and teach people to read. And for me, and maybe this is an appropriate note on which to conclude, the big insight was that there wasn't a Protestant work ethic, that wasn't really, Weber wasn't really right about that, but there was a Protestant word ethic with a D. And that word ethic was when Christianity really became a very powerful force and a very big part of the Great Divergence. Apologies to Roman Catholics.
I'm afraid I don't want Professor Ferguson to tell an anecdote about us and the. So I'm going to refuse further questions and ask you to thank Professor Ferguson, the American Academy, ESMT very much. Thank you.